This video is used for educational purposes according to the U.S. copyright law. Hey guys, it's Discerning Dad 73, and in this video entitled A Giant Conspiracy, which is part 4 of my Angels That Sinned and Nephilim Giant series, we'll consider the likelihood that there has been a huge cover-up in the world, and specifically in America, by the powers that be, including the government-run and funded Smithsonian Institute. And I'll put the links in the description for the first 3 videos in this series. In case you haven't watched those, I encourage you to go back through and watch them. But this is also a standalone video series that can be used on this topic. The Smithsonian Institute was begun by British scientist James Smithson, whose family eventually willed it to the U.S. government. According to the Wikipedia on the Smithsonian, it was established August 10, 1846, for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. It is a group of museums and research centers administered by the government of the United States, and I believe that's an important consideration. It became a depository for government collections of specimens from around America and the world. The U.S. Navy was used in the beginning of the 20th century to collect specimens around the world, and they boast 156 million pieces of artwork, artifacts, and specimens. The annual budget is around $1.2 billion, with a whopping 2/3 coming from annual federal appropriations. And just real quick, notice the logo for the Smithsonian. If that's not sun god worship, I don't know what is. It seems very apparent to me why they would use that logo. In fact, when you consider what the Smithsonian is supposed to stand for, you would expect there would be some type of other logo, whether it be dinosaur bones or some type of other archaeological or scientific look. But here you actually have what many would believe is indicative of sun god worship. Well, the Smithsonian has been accused over the years of buying up giant bones, stealing giant bones that were discovered, and even destroying them. And we'll get back to this conspiracy discussion, but first consider some additional evidence of giants that I have not included in my earlier videos. First of all, multiple newspaper reports of giants 7 to 18 feet tall in the 1800s and early 1900s. Giants found also in burial mounds and dig sites all over America, but not just America, the world as well. Here's some newspaper clippings, this one from giant bones that were discovered in Texas of a giant skull that looks to be about almost 2 times the size of a normal human skull. And this is from the San Antonio Express. Also, there was an article in 1919 that was written about a supposed find of an 18-foot giant skeleton. In Minnesota, there was a skull that had been discovered in a mound, and they found about a dozen men and women mixed with bones of various animals. And it says that it was the skull and bones that were found were abnormally large. It says the man who bore it was evidently a giant, and this was also reported by the New York Times in 1882. Then there was another article from Winnemucca, Nevada, published by the St. Paul Globe in 1904 about a group that was engaged in digging gravel. They went down to about 12 foot depth, and they found a partial skeleton of a gigantic human being. Then a Dr. Samuels examined it and pronounced them to be the bones of a man who must have been nearly 11 feet in height. Here's an article about skeletons of giant Indians found in the state of Oregon. They found skeletons of 12 giant Indians and uncovered by some workers. One jawbone was particularly of immense size. And of course, they're divided on their idea over whether this was an ancient burial ground or battleground. But it's interesting to know that many Native American legends And accounts will say that there were a species of giants who often carried off their women. So could these giants who appeared to be Indians, could they actually be perhaps of the race of giants that mixed with some of the Native American peoples? Here's an article, again published by the Times in 1897, about a discovery of mounds in Wisconsin, and they found the skeleton of a man of gigantic size, over 9 feet tall in a fair state of preservation. And they found some other relics that were among the bones that were found. Also, in New York, there was a group of people that were working. They found several skeletons of unusual size. Here is from 1885, New York Times, Victoria, British Columbia. They found some skeletons, a petrified giant body who appeared to be that of a human being. Says that it appeared that the head had been scalped. And that's interesting, because if this was some type of a giant, we also have reports from Native Americans who said that they had warred with these giants. It says that the man, when alive, must have been about 12 feet in height. So we're not just talking about a tall person like a basketball player, something like that, but 12 feet in height. Then we also have reports in Mexico about a cave containing some 200 skeletons of men, each above 8 feet in height. So not just a skeleton or two, but 200 skeletons, each above 8 feet in height. This was also reported by the New York Times in 1908. And I don't have time today to go into a lot of detail about burial mounds, but as I've been researching this, we seem to find that there are many, many burial mounds all over the United States, and particularly in Ohio, the Serpent Mound being one of the most famous. But some of the Indian chiefs have also said on record that some of these burial mounds were not from them, that the burial mounds were from the race of giants that they lived alongside of and often had to war with. So many times archaeologists or scientists will say that these burial mounds all came from the Indians, but the Native American peoples themselves are reporting that that's just not true all of the time. Here's an art piece from Mexico depicting a giant that was killed. And you notice the size differential there. Certainly that's not an average size person. And there's a lot of other art which I don't have time to go into today, but just giving some different categories of evidence before we go back to the Smithsonian cover-up part of this video. Here's a picture I've used before in one of my videos about a giant Indian skeleton that was found. And I put this in here just to show some proportion as well. Notice that this man is not only several feet taller than even the tallest man there pictured, but he seems like very much proportionately larger as well. And I believe that the bigger giants of previous history were not just tall, but they were proportionately large, and hence the Bible talks about their might and their strength. Here's another famous picture that's been in some recent books about giants of two giant people, and it was reported that the man in the center there was about 6 feet tall. So that may give you some indication of the height of the others. Here's some pictures that possibly could be of modern giant discoveries. And I'm not a photo expert. I know there have been some photos circulating around the web that have either been purported to be or proven to be false. But even if some of these modern photos are doctored, when you look at the evidence that we have in the Bible, it certainly speaks of truth when we look at the biblical stories. And just because a photo is doctored doesn't mean that what the Bible reveals is not true. Here's another picture I found very, very interesting. If that's a legitimate picture, then you're looking at somebody who's probably 18 to 20 feet tall. I mean, look how big that skeleton is, all crumpled up. And notice also the size of the bones. I mean, that femur appears to be at least 5 feet tall, 5 feet long, maybe longer. Here's a picture of a man holding a femur bone, or what looks to be of a femur bone that was reported to be about 1 1/3 meters long. The average femur bone is about 19 inches, so that would make this femur bone, if this is a legitimate picture, at least 2.5 times the size. And notice the thickness too. That's like 3 to 4 times thicker than what the typical femur bone would be. So back to the Smithsonian. There have been reports over history of people who have discovered giant bones, giant remains, and reported it to the Smithsonian, and the bones have disappeared, or the bones were purchased. There have been many people who believe that the Smithsonian destroyed many of these bones. But let's consider one article that was put out that some have said is a hoax. There was an article in the World News Daily in 2014 that said the Smithsonian admitted to destruction of thousands of giant human skeletons in the early 1900s. And Snopes came out and said that this was just patently false. They called World News Daily a fake news site or a satire site. And honestly, I've seen evidence on both sides of that. I'm not really sure what's exactly true. But let's just say, for purposes of argument, let's say that that World News Daily article was false, and that the Smithsonian did not destroy bones, that the Supreme Court did not order them to produce evidence to that effect. And let's say that Snopes is completely legitimate, which I have my suspicions about. Some believe that Snopes is actually funded by George Soros. If there's even a little percentage of that could be true, then that's a red flag. But I'm going to give World News Daily the benefit of the doubt and the Snopes, and let's say that they're completely accurate. Just based on the fact that the Smithsonian as a government-owned and funded agency is a huge red flag to me. But let's look at something from the Smithsonian's own site. In fact, they had a library that unveiled an exhibit called Darwin's Legacy, and this revolved around the 150th anniversary of Darwin's book on the origin of species. And so they're certainly paying homage to Darwin. And we know that the Smithsonian is always trying to push things related to evolution and supposed evidence related to evolution. So let's think this through. Let's say that the World News Daily article is a fake news or satire, and let's say that the Snopes is completely right here. But even if that's true, should we dismiss completely the possibility or likelihood that the Smithsonian knowingly suppresses the truth about giants or Nephilim? The answer is no. Well, why do I say no? Let me give you some very strong reasons for this. Number one, the Smithsonian, by its own admission, houses over 50 million artifacts and specimens. 50 million. You mean to tell me that they've never investigated and witnessed the many giant skeletons found all over the U.S. and the world, documented in article after article in many different newspapers all over, the whole globe, and that they did not themselves come across any giant bones or evidence of giants in all their years of research and discovery, that they don't have any evidence of giants stashed away? I mean, give me a break. I find that hard to believe. And when I say globe, of course, I don't really believe that the Earth is a globe. I believe that it is a flat plane, that's what the biblical cosmology shows. But we've been shown globes since we were little kids, and man, it is hard to get that terminology out of your brain, no matter how hard you try. So that was point number one. Point number two, Their connection to the government, which has been proven repeatedly to be secretive and even anti-truth, anti-Bible, anti-God. Does this mean that they should be trusted on the subject of giants? A subject which in fact proves, at least in part, that the Bible is right and evolution is wrong? Do you really think that they would come out supporting that and giving the Bible any shred of credibility? Number 3, the statements in the Bible show the existence of giants 9 to 36 feet tall in many of the accounts, and by some accounts even larger. These are stated in the Word of God as facts and corroborated over and over with actual earthly physical evidence, not fake news, not satire. Newspaper articles as well from all over the world show these skeletons, especially from the 1800s and early 1900s, and the Smithsonian, which happens to be around since the early 1800s, is government funded, but they don't have any evidence of this. In fact, they have evidence of, quote-unquote, evidence of all sorts of things that supposedly support evolution, which is obviously Darwin and evolution, quote-unquote, science, the main thing that they are focused on. Well, in my opinion, there has been a giant cover-up of history. The governments of the world are all in on it. The Smithsonian is part of this suppression of truth. So check the facts for yourself. Use discernment and trust the Word of God above all other reports or supposed pictures or evidence. Trust the testimony of history that you can verify and see with your own eyes and you can research. That's what we need to be doing here. If we're actually seekers of truth, we will do that. And so I'll leave the conclusion up to you, but I want to encourage you to study for yourself. And I want to thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at discerningdad73@gmail.com. And that should be discerningdad with a D-I-S-C. Apologize for the typo there. But discerningdad73@gmail.com. I hope that you'll use discernment in your seeking of truth, and God bless you and your families.